Welcome, this is Najma Minhas with Global Village Space. I'm joined today by the senior trade economist at the World Bank, Gonzalo Varela. We're going to demystify the Pakistan's obsession with import bans, import duties, and the thought that this brings benefit to the economy. Gonzalo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Gonzalo, you know Pakistan as it is right now, we're standing with around $10 billion foreign exchange reserves. Our exchange rate is shooting through the roof. The government has brought the import ban as a solution to this. Will it work?
Well, let me first start by saying that the situation is a complex situation. And I honestly do not envy the policymakers that need to make decisions at this time. The trade-offs are complex. Now, to go to your specific question, I have to say that I believe the import ban will not deliver on the intended objective, that is decrease the current account deficit. And it will not for two reasons. First, because if you look at the SRO of the import ban, there are 194 tariff lines that are targeted, out of about 7,000 tariff lines in the code, right? So we're talking about a small fraction of imports. But if you look at how much Pakistan has imported of these 894 products over the last 9 months, let's take the last 9 months, we're talking about $900 million worth of imports out of an import bill that is about $55 billion. So we're talking about 1.6% of imports that are targeted by this ban.
Okay.
So if what you want to do is you want to reduce imports in a substantial manner so that your need for foreign exchange is reduced, well, you're only targeting a small part of those. But more importantly, the other thing that needs to be considered is which are the products that were targeted and which are the products that were not targeted. So take, for example, mobile phones, completely built units of mobile phones, or take autos, completely built units of autos. So what is likely to happen is that if you ban the completely built units of mobile phones, firms will import the semi-knocked down mobile phones or semi-knocked down cars and assemble at home. So you may say, okay, that's good.
That's good, exactly. It's made in Pakistan. We create jobs.
You add a little bit of value here, so that's good. But keep in mind what is the intended objective. The intended objective is to save on foreign exchange. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to substitute the imports of CBU cars for imports of semi-knocked down cars. So you will still import, just with a different composition. Now, the other issue is that the duties before the ban, the duties on completely built cars were much higher than the duties on semi-knocked down cars. So now you're going to be still importing a different type of product, but receiving much less of tariff revenue, because these products now you're going to be importing are parts or components that are typically taxed with a lower rate.
Very interesting. And when you talk about this, the tax revenue part, what kind of numbers are we thinking in terms of the lost tax revenue as a result of increasing import duties?
Right. So as a result of the import ban, what you can say is to get an approximation to the foregone revenues, you can say, well, let's look at how much it was imported the first 9 months, as I mentioned, about $900 million, and how much those items paid in import duties, customs duties, regulatory duties, and additional customs duties. These are the three. They have different names, but they're all the same. They tax imports and do not tax domestic produced goods. So if you combine the three of them, for those $900 million worth of imports that are affected by the ban now, we're talking about 63 billion rupees foregone, that will be foregone in revenue. That's for 9 months, right? For a period of 9 months. So we're talking about 5.5 billion rupees a month. So for the 9 months, this is, to put it in a different currency, so at $1/3 billion dollars that would be foregone if this ban remains, let's say, for a period of 9 months.
So $300 million will lose in terms of tax revenues.
300, yes, exactly. 300 million is foregone in terms of
But isn't it still worth for the country? Because the numbers that the government is saying is that we will be saving almost $4 billion for the year by not importing these things. So that's not much tax revenue lost.
So according to our numbers, what the imports of these products in the first 9 months of the year were $900 million.
Okay.
So if you stop importing them for, say that this ban lasts for another 9 months,
right,
what we would expect is that you don't spend those $900 million.
Okay.
But that's not the end of the story.
Right.
There are two things that happen. The first one is the substitution of imports for different types, as I was mentioning before.
Right. You
switch over, no more mobile phones, but the parts and components to assemble the mobile phones at home.
Okay.
Right? So your reduction in imports is not going to be 900 million. It's going to be a little bit less than that because you will import more of other things.
Okay.
So that's one part of the story.
Right.
The other part of the story is that the problem that is trying to be solved is the lack of foreign exchange.
Right.
So you want to save dollars, right? So you can save dollars because you import less, but you can also save dollars if you export more.
Okay.
Right? So you need to look at the whole picture. So
but exporting more takes more of an effort, right? And it's a much longer term process. So isn't this a good way in the short term to actually deal with the issue of saving dollars?
It is not. It is not. First of all, because it's a tiny drop in an ocean.
No, but therefore the suggestion would be we should ban even more imports.
No, because what happens if you ban more imports is that basically you create a monopoly power for domestic companies in the country if they choose to sell domestically. You're basically eliminating all competition to domestic firms.
Okay.
In the Pakistani market.
Right.
Because you're saying imports stay out. So when you're saying imports stay out, you create a monopoly power for these firms to operate domestically.
Okay.
So as you said, exporting is a complicated thing. You know, it takes effort.
Right.
So the firms have now a choice. The import ban gives me a monopoly power over this nice market that I have very close to home, at home actually.
Right.
Or I can go through the effort of exporting.
Okay.
Right? What would I choose? Well, the government made it very convenient for me to focus on selling at home.
Right.
Not at exporting.
Okay, so that's an interesting argument that you're making because one of the criticisms that many people have done is we've started importing huge amounts of cars, for example. Maybe a couple of $1 billion worth of cars have been coming in the last couple of years. And the criticism has been that, we're wasting foreign exchange on importing these cars when we could have local made cars, which are available in the market. But then the criticism that people give to the local cars is A, they're overpriced, and B, they're really old models. Is that the direct result of keeping cars out of the market for so many years? Well,
the car example is a very nice example of what import duties do to the productive capacity of a firm and to the productivity of the firm. So Pakistan. And there you have an experiment that was put in place in the country for decades. So if import duties help an industry grow and become better, then we should see it in the auto industry in Pakistan because they benefited for substantial protection for decades.
Yes.
And what we see is that this is not a sector that has actually prospered and become export-oriented, grew its productivity, and then export its cars to the world. So the value added that is generated in the auto industry is limited. It's mainly assembly. But it's also is value added that doesn't get to produce any foreign exchange because it's not exported. If anything, it demands a lot of foreign exchange because you need to buy all the parts and components that come from the rest of the world. So it's a very import-intensive sector. So these import duties in the auto sector actually created more imports.
Okay, so you're saying basically that the policy is a fallacy because it destroys your domestic industry, or it enables your domestic industry to continue the way it is, but it hurts your domestic consumer. And at the same time, you're not saving many dollars, right? So why do governments keep doing it in Pakistan? Because it's not the first government. This is every government comes in, and when they have a dollar shortage, they introduce either import duties or they ban imports.
Right. You could argue that preserving the status quo is always easier than any sort of transformation. Any transformation, any policy reform is in a way an experiment, right? There are uncertain results, but the status quo, you see it, right? So there is some degree of risk that you're taking when you're making a reform.
Right.
So even if you're seeing that reform worked for so many other countries, Vietnam is a case in point. Vietnam liberalized its trade, and that liberalization of trade did not bring about an increase in the trade deficit. Quite the opposite. What it did was it helped Vietnam attract a lot of foreign direct investment that was export-oriented. They set shop in Vietnam to sell to the world. Samsung is the typical example, the type of pioneer firm in Vietnam that was transformational. And so what you ended up seeing there is that by reducing trade costs, by liberalizing trade, reducing trade costs, what you do is you integrate into global value chains, attract the foreign direct investment that gives you that export orientation that you need to grow. But that takes the let's say the decisiveness to go with a reform that will imply having losers and winners.
Right.
So when you reduce import duties, consumers are benefited.
Okay.
Right? Exporters are benefited in general.
Okay.
But those that focus on the domestic market will see their profits fall.
Okay.
So in the long term, this is a good thing for the economy. Why? Because you are going to end up allocating these resources according to the best possible uses. We call it comparative advantage, right?
Okay.
But you need to have the infrastructure to be able to compensate the losers so that they are not out of the system forever and ensure that these workers can be retrained and can join the sectors that are going to be growing and are going to be booming.
Okay.
So you need that infrastructure. It's not about reducing import duties and not doing anything else.
Okay.
Right? It's reducing import duties and helping firms access export markets and helping workers that are displaced from their previous jobs find new jobs.
So you're saying, I want to understand, is this what you're saying, that by increasing import duties, in essence, government is avoiding making the bigger reforms for the economy that it actually needs to do? And all it does is help a status quo type manufacturer or a consumer or so on.
That's correct. That's correct. There's a political economy dynamic with trade reforms. Who are the main winners of trade reforms? The consumers.
Right.
Why? Because prices with reduced import duties, prices will fall, right? So you will consume cheaper products, not just imported products. Also, the prices of domestically produced products will fall because they face competition, and so there will be a reduction.
Okay.
Now, you will have 220 million consumers in Pakistan that are going to be benefiting from this, perhaps paying 1, 2, 3 percentage points less for the products they buy. But you have a reduced number of firms that are going to be negatively affected by this, that are going to see reductions in their profits. Okay. It happens that these reductions in their profits are large enough for them to organize themselves and go and knock on the doors of Ministry of Commerce or Ministry of Finance and ensure that this doesn't happen.
Right.
For consumers are atomized, right? They are small all over. There are many more, but the gains are so small that they will have no incentive to get together and go and knock on the doors.
But in this country, the exporters who you say would benefit from this policy are actually a huge lobby. So why don't we see that happening in Pakistan, that lobby wins and achieves what it wants to? And we do generally see that, right?
So many of the exporters that will gain from this change are not yet there.
Okay.
Right? So they are potential exporters. So they can't possibly go and lobby because they haven't seen that there's a potential for them to come into the market. The existing exporters actually lobby for reduction in import duties big time. The last budget, the Finance Act of this past fiscal year, brought about a reduction in import duties of intermediates relevant for the textile sector by 20%.
Yes,
that's a big reduction. Of the reduction in import duties in the last budget wasn't so big, but the reduction for textiles intermediates was substantial. Right. They fell by one.
And you approve of that?
Well, you need two things. You need two things. You need to reduce the tariffs on intermediates. That's good. It's good for productivity. We see it in Pakistan. We did a study on this. We looked at the relationship between the productivity of firms and the import duties on the intermediates they use. When the import duties on intermediates fall, firms have access to different options. They can buy different inputs, combine them differently, and produce things in a better way. So their productivity increases.
Okay.
There's evidence in Pakistan for that and in the rest of the world too. But it's not just about reducing tariffs on intermediates. That's great. Gradually, tariffs on the final good also need to fall. Because if they don't, you just give a lot of effective protection. You give a lot of protection to firms. You give them the inputs cheap, but you keep the final good tariff high, and so you're giving incentives to sell domestically.
Right.
For the textile, this is not a big issue.
Okay.
Why? Because the textile sector is very big and it's very export oriented.
Okay.
So even if you create them a captive domestic market,
right,
they will continue exporting because the domestic market is
not big enough for them.
Right?
Okay.
They are super large.
Okay.
But for other sectors that are much smaller, if you give an incentive for them to sell domestically, if you increase artificially their profits in the domestic market, they will never make that jump into global markets.
Into exporting. Such as mobile phones, for example, or automobile industry.
Mobile phones, but even smaller sectors of household appliances, light engineering in general.
And do you think this is one of the reasons, the fact that I think internationally Pakistan has some of the highest import duties across the world? Do you think this is the reason why we have never had a domestic appliance industry, home appliances, for example, which have been exporters?
Most likely. If you put all countries together, right, and you rank them according to the level of what we call cascading, so that the import duties they pay on the final good and the import duty they pay on the raw material intermediate. So that difference is that effective protection you're giving them, right? So if you rank them according to cascading, Pakistan comes top 5 of the countries in the world, right? Wow. And then if you at the same time rank the trade deficit they face, what you see is that there's a relationship. The higher the cascading, the higher the trade deficit. Okay, right? Interesting. And Pakistan fits right in there. Right. Why is that? Because of this anti-export bias of import duties. But let me say one thing that is sort of the elephant in the room that we haven't gotten into. When we say there's a large trade deficit, let's reduce imports. That is sort of not going to the actual driver of the trade deficit, right? So in the facade, right, of the trade deficit, the imports and exports, you say, okay, if I want to reduce the trade deficit, I need to reduce imports. Okay, fine. But actually, what are the underlying forces determining one thing and the other? What we know is the trade deficit is a macro imbalance that results from where? From the fact that we are consuming too much. Okay. From the fact that we don't save enough.
So if we're consuming too much, then the government did the right thing. They got rid of makeup and shampoo and pet food and so on.
No, because that doesn't affect your consumption.
Okay.
That just affects from where you're going to get it. So instead of buying shampoo, imported shampoo, you'll buy domestically produced shampoo. Right. Your consumption will remain the same. Okay. And that domestically produced shampoo will use inputs that are imported. Right. Right? What you need to do to reduce the trade deficit in a sustainable manner is deal with your macro imbalance, with the fact that your savings are too low, and your savings are too low because you consume too much, given your level of income. Okay. Right?
Right.
What we have right now is a situation in which there is a fuel subsidy.
Right.
And that fuel subsidy is telling households and firms that it's cheaper than it really is to consume fuel and to produce with fuel. So they are going to use more fuel than they would have had the price been different, right? Higher.
Yes.
So if you really want to reduce the trade deficit, perhaps focus on addressing the fuel subsidy issue, with fuels actually being your largest import component.
Yes.
So one of the arguments that is presented often when we talk about the fuel subsidy is demand for fuels is relatively inelastic to price. So people will continue demanding fuels. Estimates about demand for fuel is that in the short run, the elasticity, the sensitivity is 0.2, which means if you increase the price by 10%, demand falls by 2%. That's small, it's true, it's inelastic. Long run is 1-to-1. But in the short run, it's 0.2. Even with that inelastic demand, even with that low sensitivity of demand for fuel to the price, addressing the fuel subsidy, so increasing fuel prices, will give you more saving in terms of imports than this import ban.
Okay, so you're saying we're focused on the wrong thing altogether. What we should be thinking about is the fuel subsidy, and we didn't need to do anything about the import ban, especially given the amount of ban. Okay, will this ban help to support the exchange rate at all? Because, the exchange rate has gone from around 180-ish to 200 now. So we're all in crisis mode. Will the ban help to support the exchange rate? And does it even matter if the dollar is expensive?
So it matters that the dollar is expensive. It matters for a number of reasons. An expensive dollar is good for exporters.
Okay.
So in that sense,
so they're happy.
In that sense, they're happy, and that brings extra dollars.
Okay.
But at the same time, an expensive dollar affects the fiscal accounts because part of the debt that the government holds is in foreign currency.
Okay.
So a more expensive dollar means a higher fiscal deficit.
Right.
So the Ministry of Finance will be affected.
Okay. So they have to find more money to subsidize the fuel subsidy, for example.
So a higher dollar, a higher price for the dollar will mean higher fiscal deficit. But for households, a higher price of the dollar will mean more inflation.
Right.
Because higher dollar means that there's a pass-through from the price of the dollar to the prices of the things that we buy and consume. So for households, and particularly, this is particularly problematic for poorer households that consume more, what we say, tradable products, food products, whose prices are affected by the price of the dollar. So an expensive dollar is an issue, and the government is rightly worried about that. Now, the import ban, again, just to put in perspective, it's important to talk numbers sometimes. That import ban of 194 products is 1.6% of imports.
Okay, yep.
Small amount.
Yep.
So it's a very small amount.
Yep.
So will it reduce the pressure on the dollar?
Not much. Okay.
Probably.
So you think we're focusing on the wrong thing, actually, even to focus on how to reduce the pressure on the dollar? What should we be focusing on?
The fuel subsidy.
So the fuel subsidy is driving all of this.
I would say at this time. So let's put things in perspective.
Okay.
Let's put things in perspective. This is not so what is happening in Pakistan is happening in many countries in the world.
Okay.
So we are in the middle of, we can call it a perfect storm.
Right.
We came out of COVID thinking, okay, we are recovering now.
Yep.
Coming out of COVID, so the COVID situation, fortunately in Pakistan, didn't affect, from a health point of view, the effects weren't as we saw in other countries.
Thank God, yes.
But thanks God. But what we did see was that governments got stretched with COVID, with the duration of COVID for such a long time.
Right.
Increases in fiscal deficits, accumulation of debt.
Right.
In Pakistan and elsewhere.
Right.
But also there were supply chain disruptions across the world.
Right.
The combination of these two things, what it created was global inflation everywhere.
Right.
Because the increases in debt, in
Yes.
fiscal deficits, created the necessity for advanced economy central banks to increase interest rates to contain the overheating of economies.
Overheating, yeah.
And so what happened is increases in interest rates also increase the debt burden of countries like Pakistan.
Right.
So you have more inflation, you have an increased debt burden, and capital outflows because interest rates in advanced economies were more attractive.
Right.
And then we have the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And Ukraine-Russia conflict was an additional challenge because it drove commodity prices further up. So you have oil prices and wheat prices skyrocketing. So this is not a good situation. It's not a situation that is unique to Pakistan. It affects many countries in the world that are importers of oil, importers of food. Right? So this is a complicated situation. What happens is that if in that complicated situation, so that you will see a depreciation of currency in most of these emerging economies with similar characteristics to Pakistan. But if on top of that, you introduce a fuel subsidy, when the oil prices are very high, that's a distortion that is not helping you because it's not helping households and firms to internalize the fact that fuel prices are very high, and so we should use less of it. You're telling them, no, it's not, use more of it. So they use more, so they demand more, and then your current account problem becomes larger. The solution to that distortion is not introducing another distortion, that is the import ban. The solution to that distortion is
removing that distortion in the first place. So you put that very clearly, and I hadn't really figured out the fuel subsidy part affecting the dollar part in such a direct way that you've explained it. So I think you've really clearly explained the fact that by reducing the fuel subsidy, you bring fuel to the right price, which means that we will import less fuel, which will reduce our import bill, which will help to strengthen the foreign exchange. I mean, I know I'm kind of simplifying it, but that direct level.
Perfectly.
But while I have you here and you are a trade economist, I do want to get your thoughts, a few thoughts on how do we increase our exports? Because that's one of Pakistan's perennial issues. So what are your quick thoughts on how do we increase those?
Three things. The first one I'm going to say, because I cannot help saying it, is your import duty story.
Okay, that affects our exports as well.
Import duties are export taxes on these guys.
Okay.
You think they affect imports. They are levied on imports, true, but they create incentives for companies to sell in the domestic market. So if you have very high import duties, you will not have an export-oriented economy. These two things are incompatible. Import duties are set up in an attempt to help industrialize, to help bring import substitution. What they do in practice is export substitution because they create incentives for firms to stay at home. They give them a monopoly power over the domestic market, right? We have data on this. We have shown the fact that firms in more protected sectors export less. So the share of their sales that go to export markets is lower. When you increase import duties by 1%, profit margins of firms increase by 4%.
Wow.
So, of course, they will prefer to stay domestic. So you cannot have an export-oriented economy with the highest import duties, among the highest import duty levels in the world. So that's number one. Now, you can't just decrease import duties and expect that all of a sudden we are going to become an export powerhouse. But one of the things that import duties falling will mean is that the type of foreign direct investment that you will attract is not for the domestic market, but is for the export market. It's going to be an efficiency-seeking type of investment that you're going to be attracting rather than the market-seeking that you attract today. So more FDI that looks out, like the Samsungs in Vietnam, is going to help you grow that export base. The second thing that you need is credit. Credit for the private sector, but in particular for the export sector. Right?
So do you like this idea of the TERF?
So TERF is not necessarily export-oriented, but long-term financing facility is export-oriented. So the State Bank Pakistan runs two schemes. One that is called the Export Finance Scheme, the other one that is called the Long-Term Financing Facility. The Long-Term Financing Facility focuses on financing investment expansions, so plant expansions of exporters.
Okay.
This is a scheme that has been quite effective and relatively cost effective. So it's not only that it increases exports, it's also that the subsidy that is given, when you compare it to the benefit that it brings to the economy, it's a good relationship.
So should we expand that amongst the number of people given this, or should we expand the depth of this?
Both.
The amount. Okay, both.
You should open it up to all sectors. The State Bank Pakistan did a good job recently on expanding. Previously it was restricted. Expand it to all sectors. But more importantly, do less of the working capital financing for exporters, the EFS. Do more of the long-term financial facility that finances investments in capacity expansions, because that's what we need. More investment that is export-oriented. Right? So credit is going to be very important. The import duty story is very important. And the third thing is productivity. So policies that help productivity upgrading. One of the challenges that we see in the Pakistan economy is productivity being low. Productivity.
Is that labor productivity or general?
Total factor productivity. So when you consider both the use of capital equipment, machinery, and workers, the talent, how these things are combined, the total factor productivity has been very stagnant, in some cases declining in Pakistan. And that is a key challenge. Exporters need to be productive to be able to compete. So you need a constant growth in productivity. That takes more innovation, it takes more competition, it takes more facilitation of technology transfers. So an active policy of the government to ensure that productivity.
So you've highlighted these things very nicely in 3 categories. This is what we need: lower import duties, we need to have more of the credit to private sector, and third is your productivity. Why is it not happening in Pakistan then?
It's challenging. The main challenge that you have is that, again, for exports to take off, you have a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, right? It's not the only thing you need to do. You need to do more things, but you absolutely need to do that. And that is a tariff rationalization. And that is politically very complicated. Because you have, again, this political economy challenge in which insiders that are benefiting from these tariffs being high are going to lobby as much as possible for this not to fall. So to keep the outsiders out, right? And to keep the benefits themselves. So you have that dynamic that you have in many places, right? That is not helping that reform. In fact, one of the things that when I first came to Pakistan, one of the things we worked on with the government in a development policy loan that we prepared in fiscal year 20 was the national tariff policy. And the national tariff policy was the first ever national tariff policy the country had. It brought tariff policy making back to Ministry of Commerce away from FBR. That was a good decision because FBR had revenue considerations when setting tariffs. Commerce has a trade facilitation view when focusing on tariffs.
And is international world practices say that it should be with the Commerce Ministry and have trade as the perspective rather than revenue?
It's not necessarily with commerce everywhere. There are many countries in the world that don't have a commerce ministry. Right? Typically, it's going to be.
But should the policy have a tariff? Should the policy have a trade perspective, though?
The policy should have a trade
not money oriented
perspective, not a revenue perspective. And certainly, the implementing agency, as in this case FBR, it's better that you keep separate the policy making role from the implementing role. So that separation was very important. Since that national tariff policy was implemented, what you see when you trace import duties in Pakistan, you see a gradual increase up to the point in this national tariff policy is implemented, and then you see a reversal in that increase. Tiny, because these efforts, as I mentioned, are very difficult. There's a lot of resistance, but a gradual reduction. We expect that the country continues in this gradual process. The important thing is to give a sense of direction to the private sector so that they can prepare for what is coming. And this is why decisions that alter this, that say an import ban ad hoc, this is a challenge because it brings policy instability. Policy instability is not good for whoever needs to make an investment decision, thinking 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. So if you think of a company that is trying to invest, and then all of a sudden they receive there's an import ban on this product that was crucial for me to be able to go ahead with my investment plan. So the vision, right, and policy stability is crucial for that vision and for investment to pick up. So what you need is that direction. National Tariff Commission has been doing a great job, I would say, in advising the National Tariff Board, that is the entity that takes the decisions on tariff changes. And so it's important that whenever there are urgent measures that need to be taken for whatever reason, that the institutions work together to ensure that these decisions are the least distortive as possible, and that they bring as much information on what the unintended consequences are.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I want to ask you, there's this whole concept within Pakistan with regard to the exporters, that there's a huge elite capture process that's taking place. In your experience in Pakistan and internationally, do you see that element happening here in Pakistan, that we have elite capture within the export industry itself? And particularly textiles is the one that's usually mentioned.
Right. We talk about elites a lot, right? Everywhere. There are elites everywhere.
Right.
And elites, of course, they are going to be close to where decisions are made because they are elites. And so they're going to influence those decisions. That's not unique to Pakistan, right? In Pakistan, yes, there are many benefits that the textile sector gets. And part of that is because of its lobbying power. We can call it elite capture. We can call it lobbying power. There are countries in which lobbying is institutionalized, like in the United States. That is also,
so lobbying happens everywhere, right?
You can also consider it another form of elite capture. The challenge happens when, you can think of two things that create a problem with elite capture. One is if you have elites that can be replaced. So if there is a process of churning in the elites, right? So that today you have the textile sector as an elite, right? But there is a process that enables some outsiders to come in the circle of the elite and replace one elite with another. So you sort of have a process of competition that perhaps ends up being leading to a better outcome. So today is the textiles, but you have the ICT, the IT sector that can at some point start getting benefit, and then they all start getting their own benefits.
They become the elite.
And in a way you end up with a level playing field by the art of competition of these elites. So that is one possibility. This is not something we see a lot in Pakistan. In fact, in Pakistan, if you look from a way of looking at how the elites have evolved, is what is the production structure in Pakistan hasn't changed over the export structure certainly hasn't changed over the last 30 years. Right? So there hasn't been that change in the composition of elites. The other challenge that you may see is that there are other countries of the world in which, again, there is elite capture, like everywhere, but that these elites have had a vision that is consistent with
the country's vision,
with the country's vision, or with with a more efficient allocation of resources, or with the growth of the development process. That hasn't been the case in Pakistan, right? So Pakistan actually, if anything, we can say that the growth of Pakistan has been stunted by the inability to allocate the talent it has, the resources it has, to the best possible uses. And part of that is because of distortions that have been introduced to give more benefits to these elites. So that is a challenge. So that lack of alignment between what is good for the elite and what is good for the country. So I think that is something perhaps more distinctive
within Pakistan.
Gonzalo,
thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.